Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annarita Bonfanti. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Pavia. I want to take the opportunity here to thank all the members of the CREWS project, in particular Dr. Steele and Dr. Boyd, who I met and asked for academic help during my stay here in Cambridge. Today, after an introduction on the problems related to the study of writing in Urartu, I would like to briefly talk about a working project research I am currently undertaking. I haven't been working on this topic for a very long time, so all the data and all the ideas I present are to be considered preliminary and subject to change. Firstly, I would like to start with a very brief introduction on Urartu. Urartu is a toponym commonly used as the exonym for an Iron Age staple entity centered around Lake Van on the Armenian Highlands. The endonym of this state is Dia. At its apogee, Urartu stretched from the borders of northern Mesopotamia to the southern Caucasus, including present-day Turkey, Nakhichevan, Armenia, and northern Iran. The state rose to power in the second half of the 9th century BCE, but went into gradual decline and disappeared probably somewhere in the 6th century BCE. Just to give an idea on how the Urartian history is still not definitely established or fixed, here you can see all the possible chronologies for the king's sequence proposed by the different scholars. There is a clear confusion starting from the half of the 8th century BCE, which resulted in different interpretations of the Urartian ruler's sequence. While I find the proposal of Andreas Fuchs the more complete, as he considers in the dynasty lines all the kings mentioned both in Urartian and in external sources, for the confused period that brings to the end of the Urartian dynasty, I usually rely on the chronology proposed by Michael Rowe. This can really give an idea on how approaching Urartian history is not easy or nor straightforward. The advent of literacy in Anatolia was tightly associated with the leadership of the Urartian state. The earliest inscriptions appeared around 830 BC, during the reign of Sarduri, son of Lutitri, the king considered the founder of the Urartian royal dynasty. The development of writing in Urartu followed a pattern already seen in the Hittite case. External contacts with the Assyrian Empire prompted the adoption of both the writing system and the language, and then after a brief interlude, the borrowed script was used to write the native language. However, the use of the Akkadian was not abandoned. If it's true that it was employed on the borders of the Urartian state in bilingual inscriptions addressed to the Assyrian enemy, it is also true that during almost all the Urartian history, Akkadian was used at the Urartian court by the members of the royal family dynasty. Cuneiform writing was spread in Urartu. It is attested on different materials, mainly stone and rock, but also clay tablets, bulle, steel impressions, and bronzes. Stone, rock, and metal objects are inscribed from the very beginning of the cuneiform script adoption, while inscriptions on clay are attested, as far as we know today, only from the reign of Ruza, son of Argishti, in the 7th century BC. This novelty is usually connected to the administrative reforms performed by this sovereign, but some paleographical observations, which I will briefly mention in this presentation, may suggest that writing on tablets was a practice used since a long time. Now we start with problematic issues regarding the Urartian cuneiform, and it has already been underlined both by Gerrit Wilhelm and by Paul Szymanski how the adoption of cuneiform writing by the Urartians was an anomaly in the first millennium writing panorama for two main reasons. The adoption happened in a period when the Keilschrift culture was shrinking, being replaced by alphabetic script, and this adoption had a very circumscribed use, having been employed almost exclusively as an instrument of royal display. However, one has the impression that this cuneiform writing has not been adopted to be read, and quoting Szymanski, this was writing for an audience, but not for readers. What one should clearly note is that writing was almost only used for royal inscriptions, while all the other usual areas interested by writing are not attested in Urartu, at least not for the greatest part of its history. Writing is the most important technology for culture, but it is also one of the most important technologies for power. It is also true that, however, that a state does not necessarily need to invent or adopt literacy, and illiteracy does not prevent administration, preservation of history, religion, and the legacy of a people. But if a society is already exposed to various writing systems, one would expect that writing would be embraced as an innovation that simplifies administration and bureaucracy. But that was not the case for the European states. Now on to a tricky discussion, and I really would like to have your opinion on this. As it has already emerged, writing was a royal prerogative. The population, as far as we know, didn't adopt cuneiform writing for private purposes. However, it is clear from the list of the used signs that the writing system used in Urartu was not difficult to learn and to use. Moreover, scholars recently argued that writing was used for many mundane purposes, and it was widely available and far from restricted to a small elite. A person with basic level of literacy, usually defined as functional literacy, may have been able to read and understand a European epigraph. One should consider that the adoption or development of a new writing system may be understood as an active response by human actors to a novel social practice, which means instead of simply thinking that writing was precluded to the broader population, that this broader population may have actively chosen not to adopt the cuneiform writing system. It is accepted that writing in ancient societies was a tool of the elite used for the creation of hierarchy. However, negating the agency of the broader population in this case may appear to be reductive. The only limit I personally see for the adoption of cuneiform writing by the population living in Urartu is that for literacy to take root in a society, it has to have meaning and it needs to be in a language that is actually used by the people learning to read. The actual extent of the spread of European language can by now only be a matter of speculation. Another problem that has to be faced when approaching European writing is the adaptation of the Assyrian cuneiform to the European phonology. It is widely accepted that the European cuneiform script was largely influenced by the Neo-Assyrian script, and it is not possible to refute it, especially when observing the first European epigraph. From the beginning of the 8th century BCE, European cuneiform took its unique form, whose main characteristic is the lack of intersections between horizontal and vertical wedges. This is true when one observes the rock monuments and some bronze inscribed objects. However, when one turns to the so-called cursive writing, attested on clay and for this reason traditionally considered a late development of European cuneiform, one can observe a different situation. There are at least 18 signs whose paleography goes back to the second millennium BC cuneiform tradition, and hence differs from the first millennium Neo-Assyrian time. In particular, here you can see the European cursive sign shapes, then the Neo-Assyrian ones, and then all of these are Middle Assyrian sign shapes. It is interesting to note that the main part of the cuneiform signs interested by this archaicity derives from Middle Assyrian texts, especially display inscriptions. This raises several questions. First of all, how could a Middle Assyrian scribal tradition have survived up to the 7th century BC? Then, is the so-called Urartian scribal school more ancient than one could possibly think, thanks to the first survived inscriptions? Are tables to be considered a writing device used from the beginning of the Urartian scribal tradition? Okay, now we'll go on some issues on European so-called hieroglyphic writing, but before, some theory on writing. The methodology I intend to use owes its fundamentals to the research summarized in the volume edited by the members of the CREWS project in 2021 entitled The Social and Cultural Context of Historic Writing Practice. I intend writing as a graphic means of communication rather than a system circumscribed to speech, and for this I include in the definition of writing also semasiography. This can be useful when one approaches European writing. On the Armenian Highlands, not only one can see many attestations of cuneiform writing, but also some sporadic so-called hieroglyphic signs. These have been approached in many ways by different scholars, but none of them managed to find a definite solution to the problem of hieroglyphic writing in Urartu. I find it important to distinguish a more proper pictographic writing, which is the one represented on the left of the slide, and a more linear white one on the right of the slide. In both cases, the writing systems are largely, if not completely, undeciphered, and only tentative suggestions have been advanced, so much so that Miri Salvini defined it as a Vorstufe einer Schrift, as the only deciphered symbols are to be found on Titoi, indicating their capacity. These are interpreted as sorts of memos used by literate warehousemen, and they are in contrast with the prestigious cuneiform script. But if this may be true with regard to the linear script, even if from display tablets found in Toprakale the system appears slightly more complex, one can find the so-called hieroglyphic or pictographic writing also on royal objects, in many cases accompanying the cuneiform script. This moves the focus on the relation between the pictographic script and the cuneiform one, and more in general on visual aspects of the Urartian writing system as well. One should deal with the proper visual impact of cuneiform writing, the interaction of cuneiform writing with the so-called hieroglyphic script, and the interface between writing and images in Urartian artifacts. If image and text are used in complement to each other, they constitute an overall message that is conveyed jointly by visual and linguistic codes. Okay, we go on and reflect on agency in ancient writing. And if we go back to the definition of writing itself, we see that writing is an element of social practice carried out by humans. This means that we should not look at writing as an abstract concept, but as something related to the agency of human actors. This also ties a link with the archaeological record. Writing is incised or carved on an object with an archaeological context, which should be treated as an archaeological find. That's another problem one faces when approaching European writing, but I find it a common issue regarding every written document found in archaeology, as writing is considered an abstract entity, a text that can provide information for its content more than for its materiality. A more material approach, considering the agency in ancient writing and not only the philological issues of the inscribed text, could be helpful, as it could change the perspective of the archaeologists, who tend to relegate the study of inscribed material to the philologists, as philology seems to be something totally separated from the archaeological records, and more importantly, so difficult, abstract, and impossible to learn. Interpretations, so, must account for the original historical and cultural context of the act of writing, as well as the specific material features of the inscription. What is the support? How was the text written? How did it combine to create meaning? For this purpose, the study of agency in writing, I want to rely on what Dr. Boyce wrote in his paper called Towards the Social Archaeology of Writing Practices. He evidenced four main steps for the study of agency in writing, which I will briefly summarize here. One should remember again that agency is inextricably connected with the materiality of the written text, which means the inscribed object itself and its content. For this reason, the first step to take in order to analyze agency in writing should be the physical study of the object itself, and then the definition of its features. The object should be treated in an archaeological way. Secondly, it is important to consider the archaeological context of the inscribed object, which should be approached as part of general archaeological assemblage. Then one can study the links between the inscribed object and the other ones found in the same archaeological context, trying to reconstruct the place of writing among social practices. And finally, we can focus on what can be called writing systems, studying the way they are modeled by society itself. Okay, last part, it's a brief overview on the instruments for the study of European writing and a super brief overview of my research plan. The preliminary consideration I just presented are just a small part of the issues one can deal with when approaching a study of European writing, which is the aim of my current and hopefully future research. Luckily, when facing this topic, one can find great help in the most recent publication of European texts, the Corpus dei Testi Urartai, published by Mirio Salvini from 2008 to 2018. We are dealing with the actual Bible for European studies, and in it, the texts are divided according to the support on which they have been found. Firstly, the hundreds of texts inscribed on stone and rock, for which a thesaurus and detailed pictures are provided in separate volumes. Then the text inscribed on bronze, clay, and other supports. To give an idea of the variety of supports used by European scribes, I will read the translation of the contents of Salvini's Corpus, Volume 4, inscriptions on metal objects, inscriptions on clay, which means clay tablets, bulle, seals, and pithoi, inscriptions on other supports, such as beads and bone bracelets. Writing was certainly an important issue in Iraq. There is also an online version of the corpus called ECOS, Electronic Corpus of the European Text, digitalized, adapted, revised, and lemmatized by Dr. Birgit Christiansen from LMU. ECOS presents European texts in transliterations with annotations for individual words, English translations, and glossaries of European words, proper nouns, and logography. As we can see, there are many resources useful for the study of European writing, despite the occasional lack of pictures of the inscribed objects. My research plan, which is still a work in progress, is divided in different steps, ideally to be approached over some years. It would involve both the agency approach I described before and a more traditionally philological approach, and it will start from the very beginning, which is the introduction of cuneiform writing on the Armenian Highlands. The step I would like to approach would be the following. First part of my research would be an analysis of the reasons behind this adoption and the link between writing and the ruling dynasty. Central to this step is the focus on the actors who first decided to write in a place where writing was previously unknown or unused. Then a philological analysis of the adaptation of Assyrian cuneiform to the European needs, always keeping in mind the agency approach. Then I would consider the use of writing and its materiality, aiming at the reconstruction of a sort of writing panorama of the European territory. Deriving from this research, there would be an analysis of the visual aspects of the European writing practice. Finally, I would like to contextualize European writing, its adoption, adaptation, and use into the broader panorama of the ancient Near East. Comparisons may be done considering Hurriat, Hittite, and Ugaritic, all cases in which writing was adopted and adapted from a foreign environment. Concluding, there are many issues involved in this kind of research, which I would like to approach with different methods. What was the relation between the cuneiform writing and the royal dynasty? What was the role of writing in the Urartian state? To what extent was writing diffused in Urartu? And can this tell something about the diffusion of the Urartian language itself? What was the interaction between cuneiform and other writing systems used in the Urartian area? What changes interested the Urartian cuneiform during the centuries? How can we contextualize the Urartian experience in the broader panorama of the ancient Near Eastern cases? There probably are many other problems to face that will pop up during this research, and many others to which will not be possible to provide an answer. Sure thing is, research is still needed in this field of study. Thank you very much for your attention.